She thought her parents died in random gang violence until the Mafia boss enemy told her the truth. 12 years earlier, Maya lost both parents to a stray bullet and spent her entire life documenting corruption. Then Dmitry Volkov kidnapped her and revealed the secret that destroyed everything she believed. Her father had photographed Dmitry bribing a federal judge. The police were already on the Bratva payroll, so Dmitry personally ordered her parents killed. Maya's childhood tragedy was never an accident, and now the same man was preparing to execute Gabriel, the Mafia boss, who had walked into the warehouse alone to trade his life for hers. Have you ever thought about how fast your entire life can change? I am not talking about years or months. I am talking about seconds. A single heartbeat, a single choice. It was a Tuesday night in Chicago. The kind of freezing, miserable rain that makes the neon signs bleed right into the wet asphalt. I was just a freelance photographer. My name is Maya Sinclair. I was exhausted. I was completely broke. I had just finished covering a depressing story on the south side of the city. I was documenting working-class families being kicked out of their generational homes. I was shooting pictures of soulless luxury condos taking their place. Nobody seemed to care about my work. People like to look away from the ugly truths of the real world, but I cannot look away. It is just not in my nature. I was standing on the curb. I was shivering. I was waiting for a cheap Uber. The city felt incredibly heavy that night. The sky was a sickly, bruised shade of green. It felt like the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to snap. A black car finally pulled up. I jumped into the back seat. I just wanted to go home, lock my door and sleep, but then the car door opened again. A man slid into the seat right next to me. He brought the wild storm inside with him. He was wearing a bespoke suit. It was dripping wet. He smelled like expensive cedar wood, and he smelled like copper, fresh, hot, metallic blood. He did not even look at me. He just told the scared driver to drive. His name was Gabriel. Before I could even ask him what was going on, the world literally exploded around us. 2 massive black SUVs boxed our small car in. The dark intersection turned into an absolute war zone in a fraction of a second. Glass shattered everywhere. Deafening, bone-rattling cracks of automatic gunfire tore through the heavy rain. Listen to me very carefully. Real life is not like a Hollywood movie. Real gunfire is completely terrifying. It is loud enough to make your ears bleed. It smells like sulfur, burnt rubber, and sudden death. The Uber driver screamed in pure terror. He kicked his door open and ran into the night. I froze completely. I was paralyzed by the fear. But Gabriel did not freeze. He lunged right over me. He pushed my head down hard to the dirty floorboards. His heavy, solid frame covered mine completely. A total stranger was actively shielding me from the bullets. My heart was hammering wildly against my ribs. I thought I was going to die right there on the floor mats. But then my deepest instinct took over. I am a photographer. I document the truth. That is how I process severe trauma. My camera was still hanging around my neck. I did not close my eyes and pray. I pushed the heavy lens up toward the shattered car window. I pressed the shutter button. Flash, flash, flash. I captured the angry faces of the shooters outside. I captured the dark, violent tattoos on their necks. I captured the license plates in the pouring rain. It was pure, unthinking muscle memory. When the heavy shooting finally paused for a reload, Gabriel grabbed my arm. He dragged me out of the ruined car. We ran blindly into a dark, flooded alleyway. We were breathing so hard our lungs burned. He pulled out a dark handgun. He checked the magazine with terrifying efficiency. Then he turned and looked at me. He really looked at me. His eyes were dark green. They were cold. They were calculating. He saw my camera hanging there. He knew exactly what I had just done. He reached deep into his wet jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of bills. $5,000 in cash. He told me to delete the photos and walk away. Just like that, a cold, calculated transaction. He was trying to buy my silence. $5,000 was life-changing money for a broke artist like me, but I looked at his bloody cuff. I looked at his desperate, tired eyes. I grew up in this tough city. I know how the real world works. I know that truth is the only currency that actually keeps you safe in the long run. I took my camera in my shaking hands. I pressed delete on the main folder. I showed him the empty, glowing screen. He nodded slowly. He thought he had bought me off, but he did not know my secret. I kept a hidden backup SD card tucked securely inside the battery grip. I did not keep it to blackmail him later. I kept it because of my own dark past. 12 years ago, my parents were killed by a stray gang bullet. They were treated as just collateral damage in a city that treats human lives like trash. I learned a very hard lesson back then. If you do not hold the powerful accountable, they will step right on you and never look back. Gabriel Ravellini was the terrifying head of the Italian syndicate. He thought he was just tying up a loose end in a dirty alley. He had absolutely no idea that he had just met his match. You always think you can just walk away from grave danger. You think the storm ends the second the rain stops falling. But exactly 2 days later, the real nightmare began for me. I was walking down Lincoln Avenue in the middle of a sunny day. A black sedan was creeping slowly behind me. It had heavily tinted windows. It was prowling like a hungry animal. It was the Bratva, the brutal Russian mob. They had checked the city security cameras. They had tracked the Uber ride. They knew my face to them. I was not a human being with a life and dreams. I was a liability. I was a loose end that needed to be violently snipped. Panic choked my throat. I ducked quickly into a small, crowded coffee shop. I dialed the burner phone number Gabriel had slipped into my pocket. He answered on the very first ring. 5 minutes later, a massive armored SUV hopped the curb outside. The heavy door flew open. Gabriel pulled me inside. We sped away long before the Russian killers could react. He took me straight to his penthouse in the Gold Coast. It had massive floor-to-ceiling windows. It had cold, flawless marble floors. It was a beautiful gilded cage, looking down on a city that suddenly wanted me dead. I was furious. I paced the floor. I yelled at him loudly. I told him I was not a weak damsel in distress. I told him my life was not a pawn in his stupid, violent mob war. He did not yell back at me. He just stood there and listened calmly. That was the first time I truly realized Gabriel was not the monster the newspapers made him out to be. He poured us a drink. He told me the hard truth about his life. He told me he took over the dangerous family business at 26, right after his father was brutally assassinated in the street. He spent 8 long, bloody years trying to clean it up. He banned the sale of hard drugs. He strictly banned human trafficking. He protected the poor. Working-class neighborhoods that the police totally ignored. He lived by a strict, old-fashioned code. He fundamentally respected human dignity, even in the dark underworld. But Dmitry Volkov, the boss of the Bratva, had no code at all. Dmitry wanted Gabriel's shipping territory, and Dmitry was willing to burn the entire city to ashes to get it. I sat quietly in Gabriel's sprawling library. I was surrounded by expensive first editions. I made a huge, life-altering decision. I opened my laptop. I showed Gabriel my hidden photography archive. Not just the photos of the alley shootout, years of highly dangerous undercover work. I showed him clear pictures of city aldermen, taking thick envelopes of cash from Bratva lieutenants. I showed him powerful judges looking the other way. I showed him the deep, systemic rot of Chicago. I explained exactly why I risked my life for these shots. Because the poor families getting evicted deserved actual justice. The kids going hungry deserved justice. The everyday people treated like dirt deserved to be seen and respected. Gabriel stared at the glowing screen. The silence in the room was incredibly heavy. Then he looked at me. He looked at me with a complex mix of total shock and profound respect. He saw a powerful weapon to completely dismantle Dmitry's political shield. I saw a rare chance to actually heal the city I loved. We formed an alliance right there in the dark. It was incredibly dangerous. It was also deeply intoxicating. Over the next 2 weeks, everything between us shifted. The cold fear turned into something else, something electric and undeniable. We spent our late nights mapping out the corrupt political networks. We spent our quiet evenings just talking honestly. He cooked for me elaborate, beautiful Italian meals. He lowered his heavy, protective guard. I saw the deep exhaustion hiding in his green eyes. I saw the soul-crushing toll of a violent life. I saw a man who was desperate for a permanent way out of the dark. He started to slowly heal my deep, lingering cynicism, and I started to firmly anchor his humanity. We were treating each other with the kind of pure mutual respect that most people search their whole lives for. But peace in the criminal underworld is just a fragile illusion. Dmitry was steadily losing ground, and a desperate cornered animal is always the most dangerous kind. The peaceful illusion shattered into a million pieces at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. My phone screamed loudly on the nightstand. It was my grandmother's neighbor calling in a total panic. Her bakery was on massive fire. The beautiful place she built with her bare hands for 40 years. Gabriel drove us there at 80 miles an hour. We stood together in the cold street. We watched the angry flames eat the roof. My grandmother was safe, but her entire life's work was reduced to smoking ashes. Dmitry had paid a weak traitor in Gabriel's own family to strike the match. It was a clear, violent message. Nowhere is safe. The real Gabwanch landed hard. Carmen, my absolute best friend, showed up at the penthouse. She was shaking violently. She was crying uncontrollably. Dmitry had just kidnapped her younger brother. He was an addict. He was struggling every single day to get clean. Dmitry cruelly used that terrible illness against him. He told Carmen that if she did not lure me out into the open, her brother would die a horrible death. He weaponized a deep human vulnerability. He treated human lives like cheap poker chips. I held Carmen tightly as she sobbed into my shoulder. I did not blame her at all. I understood her paralyzing fear, but I absolutely refused to let anyone else bleed for my mistakes. I made a firm choice right then, the kind of choice that permanently rewrites your DNA. I told Gabriel my plan. I was going to be the bait. I would gladly let them take me. Gabriel exploded in anger. He punched a solid wall. He begged me fiercely not to do it. His eyes were completely wild, not with the cold calculation of a mob boss, but with the raw, terrifying vulnerability of a man deeply in love. He promised to wage a bloody, endless war just for me. I grabbed his face in my hands. I told him to respect me. I told him to trust my strength. I was not a helpless victim anymore. I was an equal partner in this fight. I securely wore the silver tracking bracelet he gave me. I walked out into the open street completely alone. The black van screeched to a halt right in front of me. Two huge men aggressively grabbed my arms. A heavy canvas hood went over my head. The bumpy ride felt like it lasted a lifetime. I forced myself to focus on my breathing. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. I held on to the cold metal of the tracking bracelet on my wrist. I knew Gabriel was coming. The van finally stopped. They violently dragged me out into the cold air. The strong smell of rust and rotting saltwater hit my nose. We were down at the docks, an abandoned, massive shipping warehouse. They ripped the hood off my head. The harsh fluorescent lights blinded me for a second. When my eyes finally adjusted, I saw him, Dmitry Volkov. He had pale blonde hair, he had dead, shark-like eyes. He smiled a cruel, thin smile right at me. He started gloating immediately. He confidently told me Gabriel was walking into a fatal trap. And then he leaned in very close into my face. He looked at me closely. He laughed. It was a dry scraping sound that made my skin crawl. He told me he actually knew my parents. 12 years ago. He said it was not a random drive-by shooting at all. My father was a brave photographer. Just like me. My father had caught Dmitry handing a fat bribe to a federal judge. My father tried to do the right, honorable thing. He went straight to the local police. But the police were already firmly on Dmitry's payroll. So Dmitry personally ordered the hit. He brutally killed them. My entire life of pain. The empty chairs at my high school graduation. The quiet, incredibly lonely holidays. The endless trauma. It was not bad luck, it was him. The deep emotional pain hit me so hard, my knees actually buckled. But then, almost instantly, the pain vanished entirely. It burned away completely. It left behind a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity. I looked closely at the terrible man who destroyed my family. I did not cry a single tear. I did not beg for my life. I just sat there and waited patiently, because I knew my storm was coming directly for him. The heavy metal doors of the warehouse shrieked open. The entire huge room went dead silent. Gabriel walked in calmly. He was totally alone. He was not holding a gun. His large hands were raised high in the air. He was willingly trading his massive empire, and his own life, just for mine. Dmitry laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the high ceiling. He raised his pistol. He pointed it right between Gabriel's green eyes. He truly thought he had won the game. He thought human love was a fatal weakness. But Dmitry made the biggest mistake a man in power can ever make. He completely ignored the quiet girl sitting in the room. He did not respect me as a threat. He thought I was just helpless collateral damage. He was dead wrong. I did not freeze again. I did not scream for help. I tightly grabbed the heavy, rusted metal folding chair I was sitting on. I swung it wildly with every single ounce of rage and grief I had stored in my body for 12 years. I smashed it straight into Dmitry's arm. I heard the thick bone snap. The gun fired wildly up into the concrete ceiling. In a fraction of a second, the entire warehouse erupted into total violence. The glass skylights shattered above us. Gabriel's highly trained tactical team rained down from the roof. Flashbang grenades temporarily blinded the room. Thick smoke and concrete dust quickly choked the air. The noise was absolute chaos. But Gabriel did not run for cover. He dove straight across the floor, aiming for Dmitry. A Bratva soldier suddenly popped up from behind a shipping crate. He raised a military-grade assault rifle. He had a clear, easy shot at Gabriel's fully exposed back. I did not even think about what I was doing. I quickly picked up a solid steel pipe from the dirty floor. It was incredibly heavy. It was freezing cold. I ran forward fast. I swung the pipe like a Major League Baseball bat. It connected forcefully with the soldier's skull. It made a sickening, loud crunch. He dropped to the floor like a heavy stone. I saved Gabriel's life. Gabriel violently tackled Dmitry to the blood-stained concrete. This was not a beautifully choreographed movie fight. It was ugly. It was brutal. It was desperate. Brutal fists. Sharp elbows. Angry teeth. Gabriel finally got the absolute upper hand. His strong, scarred hands wrapped tightly around Dimitri's throat. He squeezed hard. He looked deeply into the terrified eyes of the man who had killed my parents. He did not let go until Dimitri stopped moving. Forever. The deafening gunfire outside slowly died down to nothing. The vast warehouse became eerily quiet. The only sound was our heavy, ragged breathing. Gabriel stood up slowly. He was bleeding quite badly from a bullet graze on his broad shoulder. His knuckles were ruined and bloody. He turned to look directly at me. He did not look at me like a fragile woman who constantly needed protecting. He looked at me like a fierce fellow warrior. I dropped the bloody steel pipe. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline. I quickly closed the distance between us. I fell hard into his broad chest. He wrapped his strong arms tightly around me. He buried his face deep in my messy hair. We survived the deadly trap. But we did not just passively survive. We actively fought back. We forcefully took back our own agency. In that dark, blood-soaked room, surrounded by the total wreckage of our pasts, I realized something truly profound about life. Healing does not mean just blindly moving on and forgetting the pain. Healing means boldly standing up to the scary monsters hiding in the dark. It means aggressively tearing them down. And it means firmly demanding the basic human respect you were always owed. The mental aftermath of extreme violence is never quiet. It lives deep in your bones. It echoes loudly in your head at night. We sat quietly in a sterile, bright hospital room later that same night. Gabriel was getting his shoulder neatly stitched up. I was standing at the small sink in the corner. I was scrubbing the dried blood off my hands. I scrubbed intensely until my skin was raw and red. I looked closely at my pale reflection in the mirror. I looked fundamentally different. I felt a heavy, crushing wave of guilt. Gabriel saw it immediately in my eyes. He walked slowly over to me. He gently wrapped his good arm around my waist. He rested his chin softly on my shoulder. He totally validated my deep pain. He told me that feeling sick about violence is exactly what makes us human. It is what firmly separates us from evil men like Dimitri. That right there is true respect. Fully recognizing someone else's trauma without ever trying to minimize it. We sat closely together on the edge of the narrow hospital bed. We made a very solemn promise to each other. We were completely done with the shadows. Killing Dimitri was absolutely necessary for our survival, but it was not true, lasting justice. Justice is highly structural. Justice is fiercely dragging the deep rot out into the bright sunlight. We desperately needed to properly heal this broken city. We urgently needed to show people that corruption only thrives when good people decide to stay quiet. So we went straight to hard work. We used Gabriel's expensive lawyers to unseal old police records. We miraculously found the original film negatives my father had taken 12 years ago. We took them back. We spent weeks hiding away in my darkroom. We carefully developed the photos together. We paired my father's old photos directly with my brand new ones. We meticulously built a massive visual timeline of a corrupt political machine. We confidently handed the entire explosive dossier to Carmen. We freely gave her the immense power to publish it to the whole world. Gabriel started actively dismantling his own massive criminal empire. He permanently sold off all the illegal fronts. He turned his lucrative security operations strictly legitimate. He generously poured millions of dollars into a trust fund for my grandmother to completely rebuild her bakery. He gladly paid for Carmen's brother to stay safely in the best rehab facility. He was clearly showing me through his positive actions that people can actually change. He strongly proved that trauma does not have to be a lifelong sentence. Exactly 3 months later, the air in Chicago was biting cold, but the sky above us was crystal clear. I stood right in the center of the Morrison Gallery on Michigan Avenue. The room was packed wall to wall. The exhibition was officially called Buried Truths. The white walls were beautifully lined with our hard work. The positive impact on the city was absolute. The FBI had powerfully raided City Hall. Corrupt aldermen had resigned. Dirty judges were formally indicted. The Bratva was fully erased. The corrupt system was finally collapsing entirely. I stood there near the entrance. I watched the people closely look at the truth. We had successfully turned our deepest, darkest pain into a powerful, shining tool for education and reform. We actively healed a small piece of the world. Carmen was safe. Her brother was sober. My grandmother was smiling so widely. The terrible generational cycle of trauma was finally broken forever. I felt a familiar, grounding warmth step up right behind me. It was Gabriel. He was wearing a classic, sharp black tuxedo. He leaned down slightly. He whispered softly that I did it. I leaned back comfortably into his solid chest. I corrected him gently. I proudly said we did it together. He turned me around slowly to face him. He looked at me with a deep vulnerability that absolutely took my breath away. He sincerely said his life used to be a long walk in the dark. He said, I bravely showed him that he could choose the light. He smoothly opened a small velvet box. Inside was a simple, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring. He confidently asked me to marry him. He beautifully said he did not want to own me. He genuinely wanted to stand beside me as an absolute equal. I smiled a wide, joyful, genuine smile. I told him I am firmly keeping my last name, Sinclair. I told him it proudly belongs to my parents. Gabriel nodded slowly. He said, "Done." I told him absolutely no more secrets. We bravely faced the darkness together. Always, I joyfully took the ring from the velvet box. I slid it onto my own finger. I pulled him down deeply into a kiss. We had bravely faced the very worst of humanity, and we had actively chosen to be much better. We had chosen to educate. We had chosen to heal. We had chosen to thoroughly respect. The city was still flawed. It always would be. But we were going to confidently face tomorrow together, totally unbroken and completely free. We thought the hard part was completely over. We were very wrong. Killing a terrifying monster in a dark warehouse is actually the easy part. Cleaning up the massive, toxic mess they leave behind is the real nightmare. The FBI formally took our massive dossier. They quickly arrested 3 city aldermen. They heavily indicted 5 senior police officers. But the political system was completely rotten to its very core. The remaining corrupt politicians panicked blindly. They fought back incredibly hard. They aggressively used the local media to smear my good name. They loudly called me a criminal sympathizer on the nightly news. They said Gabriel manipulated my vulnerable mind. They tried to legally invalidate my father's old photos. It was completely exhausting, but I did not break under the heavy pressure. Gabriel did not break. We woke up every single morning at 5 o'clock. We sat together at our heavy oak dining table. We drank incredibly strong black coffee. We meticulously reviewed dense legal documents. We hired the absolute best civil rights attorneys in Chicago, not for criminal trials, for massive civil lawsuits. We were forcefully dragging the entire city into the bright light. Gabriel sold his very last profitable casino. He took all the massive profits. He poured every single dime into a brand new legal defense fund. He specifically set it up for brave whistleblowers. He deeply wanted to protect people exactly like my parents. Ordinary people who saw something terrible. People who desperately wanted to speak out. But people who were absolutely terrified of the deadly consequences. We proudly named it the Sinclair Foundation. It was a firm, unbreakable promise to the broken city. We loudly told the public that nobody would ever have to fight corruption completely alone again. Healing is never a straight, easy line. Healing is a brutal, exhausting, uphill battle. The massive trial officially started in early November. The Chicago sky was gray and incredibly heavy. The downtown courthouse was totally packed with angry, shouting reporters. I had to bravely testify on the witness stand. I had to look directly into the cold eyes of the corrupt politicians, the exact men who paid Dimitri to kill my parents. My hands shook violently under the heavy wooden witness stand. I felt a massive, suffocating panic attack rising tight in my chest. But Gabriel was sitting right there, in the very front row. He was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. He did not blink. He just looked directly at me with total, unwavering belief. He did not jump up to try to rescue me. That right there is the absolute purest form of human respect. He deeply knew I had to fiercely fight this specific battle completely alone. I took a very deep, shaky breath. I leaned in and spoke clearly into the microphone. I told the absolute, undeniable truth. I detailed exactly how the criminal underworld operated. I calmly explained the context of every single photo. I stubbornly refused to let their expensive, aggressive lawyers intimidate me. It took 3 totally grueling weeks of testimony. The tense jury deliberated for 4 long days. When the judge finally read the guilty verdicts, I did not cheer loudly. I did not cry tears of joy. I just felt an immense, overwhelming sense of quiet peace. The restless ghosts of my traumatic past were finally put to rest. Meanwhile, Gabriel was fighting his own silent war. He systematically dismantled his entire criminal syndicate. He gathered his top lieutenants. He opened his financial books. He showed them how legitimate construction and security businesses actually generated more sustainable wealth. He gave them a firm choice: go completely straight or leave the city forever. He did not use extreme violence. He used logic, respect, and an iron will. He completely redefined what true power looks like. We actively turned our deep pain into a powerful, educational curriculum. I proudly started a free photography program for completely at-risk youth in Englewood. It was the exact same tough neighborhood where the initial shootout happened. We bought 50 brand new digital cameras. We freely gave them to quiet teenagers, kids who had seen way too much street violence. We patiently taught them how to safely document their own harsh reality. We deeply taught them the immense emotional power of framing a clear shot. We firmly Firmly showed them that their young voices actually mattered in this world. Gabriel quietly came to the classes every single Thursday afternoon. The tough kids did not know he was a former, feared Mafia boss. They just knew him as the quiet, respectful guy who always brought them deep dish pizza. He actively listened to their heartbreaking stories. He treated them with absolute, unwavering human dignity. He started formally offering paid trade apprenticeships. He hired them in his brand new, legitimate construction company. He gave them a real tangible, safe way out of the dangerous streets. We were actively replacing the deadly criminal pipeline with a solid pipeline of genuine hope. This is exactly how you actually cure a violently sick city. You do not just lock desperate people up in dark cages. You give them a solid, safe foundation to stand proudly on. You give them a completely blank canvas. You hand them the powerful camera. You step back and let them tell their own story. One rainy afternoon, a tough 16-year-old kid named Marcus bravely showed me his final photo project. He took a beautiful, highly tragic picture of a badly broken playground. But right in the blurry background, a single bright green weed was violently pushing its way up. It was growing right through the solid concrete. It was a totally perfect visual metaphor. Marcus looked directly at me very proudly. He firmly said he wanted to go to college, to be an investigative journalist. My heart swelled with pure, unadulterated joy. The vicious, generational cycle of poverty and violence was actively breaking right in front of my eyes. Our tight circle of trust grew incredibly strong over the next year. My brave best friend Carmen actually won a massive, prestigious journalism award. She won it for her fearless reporting on the Bratva collapse. She was totally unstoppable. Her younger brother was finally 6 full months sober. He was working hard at Gabriel's new logistics firm. He was proudly rebuilding his own life day by hard day. Sophia, Gabriel's incredibly brilliant younger sister, officially stepped up. She became the lead civil attorney for our new foundation. She fought aggressively for the poor families displaced by corrupt, greedy developers. She boldly sued the entire city planning commission. She actually won a massive settlement. She forcefully made the local politicians build safe, affordable housing. We were a very strange, totally patched together family unit. We were former hardened criminals. We were deeply traumatized artists. We were highly idealistic lawyers. We were stubbornly brave journalists. But we were fiercely, undeniably loyal to each other. We ate a massive dinner together every single Sunday at my grandmother's newly rebuilt bakery. The warm smell of fresh yeast bread and roasted garlic completely filled the air. We laughed incredibly loudly. We argued passionately about local politics. We actively planned our next massive educational projects. We were no longer just barely surviving the dark storm. We were truly thriving in the sunlight. Gabriel sat quietly at the head of the long wooden table. He looked completely different now. The heavy, dark, violent shadows were entirely gone from his handsome face. The constant, deadly tension had fully left his broad shoulders. He was finally a truly free, peaceful man. He successfully paid his massive moral debt to society, not with useless prison time, but with real, actionable, daily redemption. He effectively saved hundreds of young lives with his new community foundation. He bravely chose the light, and he fiercely dragged the rest of us safely up into it with him. We officially got married in late spring. It was absolutely not a huge, flashy, dangerous mob wedding. It was incredibly small and deeply intimate. We held the quiet ceremony right inside the downtown art gallery. We were completely surrounded by my raw photography. We were totally surrounded by the absolute, undeniable truth. I proudly wore a simple, elegant white dress. I stubbornly kept my heavy black combat boots on underneath it. Gabriel smiled a wide, bright smile when he saw them. He truly loved my stubborn, unpolished edges. My grandmother walked me proudly down the short aisle. Carmen stood fiercely right by my side. Sophia formally officiated the very short, sweet ceremony. I did not drop my professional camera for the day. I set it up carefully on a sturdy metal tripod right in the corner. I put it on an automatic, timed shutter release. I deeply wanted to properly capture the exact moment our complex lives officially merged forever. When we finally exchanged our simple written vows, we did not naively promise a totally perfect, easy life. We firmly promised absolute, brutal honesty. We promised deep, unwavering, mutual respect. We promised to always stand tightly together against the inevitable, dark storms of life. Gabriel gently slipped the smooth wedding band onto my finger. He kissed me softly and completely. The camera flashed brilliantly from the corner. It beautifully captured a very different kind of story now. Not a tragic story of sudden violence. Not a heavy story of deep political corruption. It perfectly captured a powerful story of profound, hard-won healing. We are all deeply flawed. Broken humans, we all carry incredibly heavy, totally invisible scars. But our painful scars do not ever have to dictate our entire future. We can actively choose to slowly build something totally beautiful, right on top of the smoking ruins. We can bravely choose to constantly respect ourselves. We can choose to deeply respect each other. The real world is often incredibly dark and completely unforgiving, but you are never, ever fully powerless. You always have a real choice. Pick up the camera, tell the brutal truth, stand your solid ground, and never, ever let the darkness win. Happily ever after does not exist in the real world. Life is incredibly messy. The heavy dust eventually settles. The high adrenaline finally fades away. You are just left with the quiet, boring reality of every single day. Gabriel and I had completely burned down the violent Chicago underworld. We had totally destroyed the Russian Bratva. We had locked away the deeply corrupt politicians. We had a beautiful, quiet wedding, surrounded by our chosen family. But deep psychological trauma does not magically disappear when you put on a gold ring. Gabriel struggled intensely during those first few months. He would wake up violently in the middle of the dark night. He would be drenched in cold sweat. His massive hands would instinctively reach for a heavy gun that was no longer hidden under his pillow. His traumatized brain was still firmly trapped in the brutal Mafia wars. I never yelled at him to just get over it. True love requires immense, unconditional patience. True respect means fully accepting someone else's ugly scars. I would just quietly turn on the soft bedside lamp. I would gently wrap my arms around his broad, shaking shoulders. I would softly remind him that we were totally safe. I would tell him the war was completely over. We actively worked on our deep healing every single day. We aggressively channeled all of our nervous energy into the broken community. We officially opened the Sinclair Ravellini Youth Center right in the absolute heart of Englewood. It was the exact same tough neighborhood where we first met during that terrible shootout. Gabriel used his completely legitimate construction company to completely renovate a massive, abandoned warehouse. We turned it into a state-of-the-art educational facility. I started teaching intensive photography classes to vulnerable teenagers. I gave them expensive digital cameras. I taught them how to firmly control their own personal narratives. I taught them that their unique voices actually mattered. Gabriel personally taught them practical financial literacy. He taught them how to legally build honest businesses. We were actively replacing the dangerous gang pipeline with a solid pipeline of genuine hope. The kids absolutely loved him. They saw a highly respected, powerful man treating them with absolute, undeniable human dignity. We were slowly, steadily fixing the deep generational rot of the city. We were finally breathing clean air. But the city of Chicago is a massive, complicated beast. It absolutely hates a quiet vacuum. A brand new, highly dangerous threat was quietly rolling into town. It was not a violent mob boss with a cheap gun. It was a massive, incredibly greedy corporate real estate conglomerate. They were called Apex Holdings, and they wanted to completely bulldoze our fragile, healing neighborhood. Corporate greed is a totally different kind of brutal violence. It does not loudly shatter your windows with automatic gunfire. It quietly slides a totally legal eviction notice right under your front door. Apex Holdings was incredibly ruthless. They aggressively targeted the working-class families of Englewood. They wanted to completely tear down the affordable apartment buildings. They wanted to build massive, soulless, extremely expensive luxury condos. They wanted to totally erase the rich cultural history of the community. They heavily bribed the local city zoning officials to look the other way. They aggressively hired highly intimidating private security contractors to harass the poor tenants. They would illegally shut off the building heat in the middle of the freezing winter. They would let the old water pipes burst and flood the small apartments. They were actively terrorizing vulnerable people to force them to move out. It was a completely sanitized, highly bureaucratic form of pure evil. I watched my brave teenage students become incredibly depressed. They were slowly losing their safe homes. The familiar, dark shadow of deep systemic trauma was creeping right back into their young eyes. One cold Tuesday morning, our brightest student arrived at the youth center, completely covered in blood. His name was Marcus. He had bravely tried to use his new camera to secretly film the aggressive corporate security guards smashing his building's boiler. The massive guards caught him. They brutally beat him up in a dark alley. They smashed his expensive camera into a million pieces. They violently threatened his mother's life. Gabriel saw the fresh blood on Marcus's young face. I instantly saw the terrifying old Mafia boss totally wake himself to Gabriel's green eyes, his jaw locked incredibly tight. The dangerous, cold darkness completely flooded his face. He instantly reached into his pocket for his secure phone. He heavily wanted to call his old, violent associates. He wanted to physically hunt the corporate CEO down. He wanted to violently burn the massive corporate headquarters to the ground. The dark, familiar temptation of easy violence was so incredibly strong. I had to act very fast. I physically jumped right in front of him. I put both of my hands firmly on his broad, tense chest. I looked deeply into his angry, wild eyes. I firmly reminded him of our unbreakable wedding vows. I strictly told him that we absolutely do not use their dark tools anymore. I told him that if we use illegal violence now, we instantly become the exact same monsters we completely destroyed. We would instantly lose the deep respect of the kids. Gabriel took a very long, incredibly shaky breath. He slowly dropped the phone to the floor. He aggressively fought his own dark demons, and he totally won. He bravely chose the peaceful light. It was the absolute hardest, most important choice of his entire life. We completely pivoted our entire battle strategy. We boldly decided to fight the massive corporate giant directly in the bright daylight. We actively weaponized the absolute truth. I immediately gave Marcus a brand new, even better camera. I gathered all 50 of my teenage photography students. I did not tell them to run away and hide. I confidently told them to aggressively fight back. I taught them exactly how to safely and legally document the severe corporate abuse. We formed a massive, highly organized investigative unit. The brave kids went out in pairs. They took incredibly raw, highly emotional pictures of the freezing children in the unheated apartments. They secretly recorded the massive security guards carrying heavy baseball bats. They captured the absolute, undeniable human suffering caused by unchecked corporate greed. We did not keep these powerful photos hidden in a dark room. We printed them on massive, towering billboards. We illegally pasted them all over the wealthy, totally oblivious downtown financial district. We aggressively forced the rich, comfortable elite to look directly at the terrible pain they were actively funding. My brave best friend Carmen joined the fierce fight. She used her massive journalism platform. She meticulously investigated the dirty finances of Apex Holdings. She found the exact, illegal offshore bank accounts they used to quietly bribe the corrupt city council members. She wrote a blistering, totally viral front-page article. Sophia stepped up and filed a massive, totally paralyzing class action lawsuit. She legally represented 300 terrified tenants, completely for free. She filed an aggressive injunction to instantly stop the heavy demolition trucks. Gabriel quietly used his massive, clean legitimate wealth. He totally outsmarted the greedy developers in the complex real estate market. He secretly bought the underlying land leases out from under them. We aggressively hit them from every single possible angle. We hit them with powerful, emotional art. We hit them with hard, undeniable journalism. We hit them with brilliant, aggressive legal strategy. We completely surrounded the arrogant bullies with the blinding, absolute truth. We actively taught the vulnerable community how to fiercely demand basic human respect. We showed the young kids that their loud voices were actually way more powerful than any illegal gun. The ultimate showdown did not happen in a bloody, abandoned warehouse. It happened inside a brightly lit, totally crowded city council chamber. It was the crucial public hearing for the final corporate zoning permits. The arrogant CEO of Apex Holdings stood proudly at the front podium. He wore a custom $10,000 suit. He smirked highly confidently at the corrupt council members. He truly thought he had enough dark money to easily buy the entire city. He completely underestimated our massive, unyielding community solidarity. We had totally packed the large room with hundreds of angry, hopeful neighborhood residents. I walked slowly up to the public microphone. I did not yell in anger. I simply turned off the bright overhead lights. I projected my students' incredibly powerful, raw photographs onto the massive white wall behind the council. The huge room went totally, breathlessly silent. I showed them the exact, undeniable human cost of their greedy decisions. I showed them the highly aggressive, legally questionable tactics of the corporate thugs. Then Marcus bravely stepped up to the microphone. He was just 17 years old. He looked the powerful corporate billionaire directly in the eye. Marcus firmly stated that his community was not garbage to be casually swept away. He demanded absolute, basic human dignity. Then Sophia calmly laid down the massive stack of explosive legal documents. Gabriel stood quietly in the very back of the room. He radiated a calm, terrifying, completely legal authority. The arrogant CEO started sweating profusely. He tried to loudly interrupt Marcus. He tried to aggressively bully the teenager, but the entire crowded room instantly erupted into massive, deafening chants. They loudly demanded justice. The corrupt city council members absolutely panicked. They saw the bright television cameras recording everything. They instantly voted unanimously to completely deny the corporate development permits. The massive, greedy corporate conglomerate was totally, publicly crushed on the spot. The aggressive development project was permanently killed. The packed room completely exploded into massive cheers and happy tears. The brave teenagers hugged each other incredibly tightly. They had actively fought a massive, terrifying giant, and they had completely won the war, using only their cameras and their absolute truth. We walked out of the massive municipal building together. The cold, crisp Chicago air actually felt incredibly clean and fresh in my lungs. The loud, happy cheers of the neighborhood. Kids totally echoed down the busy city street. They had successfully learned their own immense, undeniable power today. Gabriel tightly held my hand as we walked toward our car. I looked closely down at his broad, scarred knuckles. There was absolutely no fresh blood on them this time. He looked totally, profoundly at peace. He had successfully fought a major, city-wide war without firing a single bullet. He had completely proven that his radical personal transformation was totally real. We drove back to our quiet, safe brownstone home. We sat closely together on our small back porch, bright city stars barely visible through the heavy urban glow. I looked over at my brave, truly remarkable husband. I gently took his warm hand. I placed it flat against my stomach. I looked directly into his deep green eyes. I softly told him that I was exactly 3 months pregnant. A totally new, totally innocent life was growing safely inside me. A beautiful child who would never, ever know the dark, violent mafia life. A child who would only know a fiercely loving, deeply respectful, and incredibly safe home. Gabriel's tough eyes instantly filled with quiet, happy tears. He pulled me deeply into his broad chest. He kissed the top of my head incredibly softly. We had finally done it. We had totally broken the heavy, generational curse of violence and trauma. We were not just barely surviving the dark storms anymore. We were actively bringing brand new, beautiful, healing light directly into the world. The real world will always be incredibly complicated. There will always be new, greedy bullies trying to take advantage of the weak. The dark storms of life will always keep aggressively rolling in. But I am absolutely not afraid of the dark storms anymore. I have a firm, unbreakable anchor. I have an incredible, deeply respectful partnership. I have my heavy, reliable camera. Healing is entirely possible. You just have to actively choose it every single day. You have to stubbornly stand up to the scary monsters. You have to constantly demand absolute human respect. We will just keep actively fighting the good fight together, one single, brave photograph at a time. We truly thought the hardest part of our journey was completely over. We thought taking down a massive criminal empire was the ultimate finish line. We were incredibly naive. Building a totally new, honest life is actually much harder than destroying an old one. You cannot just magically erase decades of violence. You have to actively build something beautiful. On top of the heavy wreckage, Gabriel and I officially opened the Sinclair Ravellini Youth Center. We built it right in the absolute heart of the tough South Side. We wanted to firmly plant deep roots of hope in the exact same soil, where so much innocent blood was spilled. The massive building used to be a cold, abandoned warehouse. We painted the walls bright, warm colors. We filled the large rooms with expensive computers and comfortable chairs. Gabriel was completely transforming before my very eyes. He traded his expensive, bulletproof suits for comfortable, soft sweaters. He completely stopped carrying a hidden, heavy weapon. He spent his long afternoons teaching basic financial literacy to vulnerable teenagers. I spent my days teaching intensive photography workshops. We were actively replacing the dangerous gang pipeline with a solid pipeline of genuine education. We were completely happy. We were totally exhausted every single night, but we slept incredibly soundly. But the harsh city of Chicago is an incredibly complicated beast. It absolutely hates a quiet vacuum. A brand new, highly systemic crisis hit our fragile community extremely hard. It was not a violent mob war this time. It was the deeply flawed, highly prejudiced criminal justice system. It happened to a very quiet, incredibly talented 15-year-old boy named Julian. Julian was one of my absolute best advanced photography students. He was a gentle, highly observant kid. He used his heavy camera to beautifully document the local community gardens. One rainy Tuesday evening, a local convenience store was aggressively robbed by an armed suspect. Julian was simply walking home from the youth center. He was holding his heavy camera bag tightly. He was wearing a dark blue hoodie. Two heavily armed, highly aggressive beat cops stopped him on the dark sidewalk. They did not respectfully ask him any basic questions. They did not calmly investigate the actual facts. They did not look at the clear timeline. They aggressively threw him hard against the dirty, wet brick wall. They violently slammed heavy metal handcuffs onto his thin, fragile wrists. They totally profiled him, based strictly on his rough neighborhood and his casual clothes. They ignored his loud, terrified pleas for help. They aggressively charged him with a massive, violent felony that he absolutely did not commit. They treated a brilliant, innocent young artist exactly like a dangerous street thug. They completely stripped away his basic human dignity. In a fraction of a second, Julian's terrified, heartbroken mother called my cell phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. Her name was Maria. She was a hard-working single mother. She was crying so hysterically she could barely breathe. She begged me to help her innocent son. Gabriel and I threw on our clothes. We immediately drove straight to the cold, intimidating downtown police precinct. The heavy rain was slamming fiercely against our windshield. We walked quickly into the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the holding area. The air smelled strongly of cheap bleach and deep human despair. We saw Julian sitting completely terrified inside a dirty, concrete cell. He was physically shaking like a tiny, fragile leaf in a massive storm. His expensive digital camera was completely smashed on the floor by the aggressive cops. The heavy lens was totally shattered. The sight of that broken camera completely shattered my heart. It was a vicious attack on his pure artistic voice. I looked quickly over at Gabriel. His broad jaw was locked incredibly tight. The dangerous, cold darkness completely flooded his deep green eyes. The old Gabriel woke up instantly. The terrifying Mafia boss desperately wanted to violently tear the entire police station apart. He wanted to instantly call a powerful, highly corrupt judge. He wanted to use his massive, dark influence to aggressively threaten the arresting officers. He knew exactly how to make the bogus charges magically disappear. It would have been incredibly fast. It would have been totally effective. The dark temptation of easy, corrupt power was so incredibly strong. I completely understood his fierce, protective rage, but I had to act very fast. I physically stepped right in front of him. I put both of my hands firmly on his broad, tense chest. I looked deeply into his angry, wild eyes. I firmly reminded him of our unbreakable wedding vows. I strictly told him that we absolutely do not use their dark, toxic tools anymore. I fiercely told him that if we use illegal threats now, we instantly become the exact same monsters we completely destroyed. We would instantly lose the deep respect of the very kids we promised to protect. Gabriel took a very long, incredibly shaky breath. He closed his intense eyes. He slowly unspenched his heavy, scarred fists. He aggressively fought his own dark, internal demons, and he totally won. He bravely chose the peaceful light over the bloody dark. He deeply looked into my eyes. He nodded slowly and deliberately. We firmly committed to the harder, slower, totally legal path. We were going to fiercely fight a highly corrupt systemic giant, and we were going to actively beat it using absolute, undeniable truth. We totally transformed the busy youth center into a massive, highly organized legal defense headquarters overnight. We absolutely refused to let the broken system quietly destroy another innocent young life. We immediately brought in Sophia and her brilliant team of highly aggressive civil rights attorneys. We did not just quietly prepare for a boring, standard court date. We actively used this terrible, unfair crisis as a massive, powerful educational opportunity for all the local kids. We completely cleared out the main gymnasium. We hosted intensive, weekly legal workshops for the entire neighborhood. We brought in seasoned, battle-tested public defenders to actively teach the terrified teenagers. We clearly taught them exactly what to safely say when aggressively stopped by the police. We taught them their fundamental constitutional rights. We firmly taught them how to legally record any hostile law enforcement interactions. We actively role-played highly stressful, potentially dangerous street scenarios. We practiced remaining perfectly calm under intense, unfair pressure. We were systematically arming them with the absolute ultimate shield. We were fully arming them with deep, undeniable legal knowledge. Knowledge is the one true power that nobody can ever violently beat out of you. I visited Julian in the cold, depressing juvenile detention center every single afternoon. The harsh, sterile environment was aggressively designed to break a young kid's human spirit. The heavy metal doors constantly slammed loudly shut. I completely refused to let that dark place break him. I always brought him brand new, colorful art books. I firmly told him to completely close his eyes. I told him to vividly visualize his beautiful, vibrant community gardens. I strictly reminded him every single day that he was a brilliant, talented artist. Gabriel completely surprised everyone by coming with me one rainy afternoon. Gabriel sat down heavily on the cold, bolted metal chair right across from the terrified teenager. Gabriel did not give him empty, fake, positive platitudes. Gabriel spoke to him with absolute, brutal, raw honesty. He quietly told Julian all about his own dark, highly violent past. He shared his own massive, deeply shameful life mistakes. He completely removed the intimidating mask of the perfect, wealthy benefactor. He deeply validated Julian's intense, overwhelming, totally justified fear. Gabriel firmly looked the crying boy directly in the eye. He strongly told him that the cruel system actively wants you to feel totally worthless. He said the system feeds on your deep shame. He said the absolute greatest act of human rebellion is simply maintaining your own absolute, unbreakable dignity. He told Julian to stand incredibly tall inside that small, dirty cell. He told him to never, ever let them steal his bright soul. The highly anticipated trial date finally arrived in late November. The massive downtown courthouse was incredibly cold and highly intimidating. The aggressive city prosecutor was an incredibly ruthless, highly ambitious man. He actively wanted to use Julian as a totally unfair political stepping stone for his own career. He aggressively tried to falsely paint Julian as a highly dangerous, violent street predator. He loudly paced the courtroom floor. He used deeply coded, highly racist language to completely scare the conservative, quiet jury. But we were completely ready for his dirty, theatrical, cheap tricks. Sophia was an absolute, terrifying legal shark in the strict courtroom. She aggressively, methodically dismantled the incredibly sloppy police report line by line. She fiercely cross-examined the highly biased, highly aggressive arresting officers. She clearly exposed their massive, undeniable procedural errors. She proved they never actually checked Julian's completely solid alibi. But the absolute turning point of the massive trial was not just the brilliant, sharp legal arguments. It was the overwhelming, undeniable power of our visual truth. I had completely organized a massive, highly emotional public gallery show dedicated entirely to Julian. All 50 of my brave photography students took incredibly beautiful, highly dignified, large-scale portraits of him. We legally entered a massive, stunning portfolio of Julian's own beautiful garden photography directly into the official court record. We actively forced the strict judge and the quiet jury to actually look at his actual, undeniable humanity. We forced them to see the beautiful world exactly how Julian saw it. We completely shattered their totally lazy, highly prejudiced, toxic stereotypes. We heavily packed the courtroom gallery every single day. We filled the hard, uncomfortable wooden benches with supportive, angry teachers. We filled them with proud, vocal community leaders. We filled them with all the brave young kids from the youth center. We sat closely together in total, highly respectful, deafening silence. We just wanted the judge to physically see that this young boy was deeply, fiercely loved. We wanted the broken, corrupt system to clearly know that we were always watching them. The aggressive prosecutor completely stumbled under our intense, silent, highly unified glare. His cheap arguments totally fell apart. The jury only deliberated for a remarkably short 2 hours. When the quiet foreman firmly read the not guilty verdict, the heavy courtroom totally erupted. Julian's exhausted mother fell to her knees in pure, unadulterated, weeping relief. Julian cried huge happy tears. He walked slowly out of the heavy wooden gates. He was finally a completely free, highly vindicated young man. We threw a massive, incredibly loud celebration party at my grandmother's warm bakery that exact same evening. The highly energetic, happy music was blasting loudly out into the cool, crisp autumn streets. The entire neighborhood came out to loudly celebrate the massive victory. Julian was smiling a wide, totally unbroken, radiant smile. He was proudly holding a brand new, highly expensive, professional camera that Gabriel had quietly bought for him. It was a powerful symbol of totally reclaiming his stolen voice. I stood quietly near the warm, glowing brick ovens. I just watched the beautiful, chaotic, highly diverse crowd. Gabriel walked slowly over to me. He gently wrapped his strong, heavy arms tightly around my waist. He kissed my temple incredibly softly. He quietly whispered that we had actually built something totally real here. He was absolutely right. The heavy, dark, violent generational trauma was finally, completely, permanently dead. We had successfully built a brand new, incredibly strong, totally unbreakable family tree. It was deeply watered with immense mutual respect. It was firmly rooted in radical, highly accessible education. Life is exactly like a massive, highly complicated, deeply messy community garden. You absolutely have to violently pull the ugly, toxic, hateful weeds every single day. You have to patiently, lovingly plant brand new, highly hopeful seeds. You have to aggressively, fiercely protect the fragile new growth from the harsh, cold, completely unforgiving storms. It is incredibly exhausting, totally unending, deeply physical, hard work. But it is the absolute only work that actually matters in this entire broken world. I looked down closely at my heavy, reliable, totally battered camera hanging around my neck. I looked lovingly at my deeply redeemed, fiercely protective, incredibly gentle husband. We are the ultimate, proud architects of our own lasting, hard-won peace. We are the brave, unapologetic authors of our own totally rewritten, beautiful story. The world outside will always be incredibly flawed. There will always be terrible, unfair injustice. There will always be terrifying, greedy monsters hiding in the dark, quiet shadows, but we are absolutely ready for them now. We have successfully weaponized the absolute, undeniable truth. We have totally normalized basic, fundamental human respect. We have completely proven that profound, lasting healing is always a highly active, daily choice. If you are deeply hurting right now, please just listen to me. Do not ever let the cold, heavy darkness completely consume your soft, beating heart. Bravely pick up your own heavy camera, loudly tell your own raw, totally authentic story, strongly demand your own basic, fundamental respect. Deeply educate the vulnerable people directly around you. Fiercely protect the innocent people standing quietly behind you. You have so much immense, totally undeniable power inside you. Just take a very deep, highly cleansing breath. Step firmly, confidently out of the dark, terrifying shadows, and boldly walk directly into the bright, beautiful, completely healing light. Time always moves incredibly fast when you are completely happy. Our beautiful son Leo was finally born in the middle of a massive summer thunderstorm. He was absolutely perfect. He had my totally stubborn, unbreakable chin. He had Gabriel's deep, incredibly thoughtful green eyes. Holding him safely for the very first time completely shifted the entire axis of my world. Suddenly, our fierce, daily fight for a safe city was not just a theoretical, abstract concept. It was a desperate, primal, deeply biological need to aggressively protect this tiny, innocent new life. We spent our busy, exhausted days juggling warm baby bottles and massive community educational projects. We spent our quiet, sleepless nights carefully planning brand new art programs. The large youth center was thriving absolutely beautifully. We had hundreds of vulnerable neighborhood kids actively enrolled in our completely free classes. We taught them absolute, undeniable truth. We taught them fundamental, unwavering human respect. We taught them exactly how to bravely speak up for themselves. We felt totally, completely, overwhelmingly untouchable in our happy new bubble. But the heavy, dark, violent past always has a very strange, terrifying way of loudly knocking on your front door. It usually happens right exactly when you finally feel completely safe. It waits patiently for your heavy, protective guard to totally drop. We arrived at the busy youth center very early one freezing, dark Monday morning. The massive, expensive front glass windows were totally, violently shattered, dangerous, sharp. Broken glass was scattered everywhere across the cold, hard linoleum floor. The crisp, freezing morning wind was howling loudly through the empty, jagged window frames. Someone had aggressively, maliciously spray-painted a massive, bloody red symbol directly on the pristine main white wall. It was a very old, highly specific, deeply terrifying Mafia crest. It was a vicious, angry snake tightly wrapping around a sharp, bloody dagger. It was the exact, unmistakable crest of a highly dangerous rival family. Gabriel's ruthless father had completely, violently destroyed that exact family over 20 years ago. The dark, violent, totally unforgiving ghost of the old Ravellini criminal empire was suddenly back. It was aggressively threatening the beautiful, safe, totally peaceful sanctuary we had sacrificed absolutely everything to carefully build. I looked tightly, fearfully at Gabriel. He was holding little Leo safely bundled inside his heavy winter coat. Gabriel did not look angry at all. He did not yell loudly, his broad, strong shoulders instantly slumped. He looked incredibly, profoundly, deeply sad. He knew exactly what this terrible, bloody symbol actually meant. The heavy, totally unpaid sins of his incredibly violent father were brutally coming back to collect a massive, undeniable debt. We had to face the terrible, terrifying nightmare all over again. But this time, we absolutely refused to fight it with cheap, illegal guns. We firmly, stubbornly refused to ever let the toxic, bloody history repeat itself. We completely refused to call the local city police. We knew exactly how the deeply broken, highly biased criminal justice system handled angry, desperate, traumatized kids. Gabriel simply walked quietly into the small, dark security room. He methodically, patiently reviewed the high-definition, external camera footage. He watched the glowing digital screens with intense, totally silent focus. He easily, instantly recognized the angry, hooded face on the grainy, dark screen. It was a highly traumatized, very skinny 19-year-old boy named Tomas. Tomas was the absolute last, totally abandoned surviving son of the rival boss, Gabriel's father had brutally executed. Tomas grew up in terrible, grinding, completely suffocating poverty. He grew up completely, totally consumed by toxic, burning, deeply instilled hatred. He was violently, aggressively taught that pure, bloody revenge was his absolute only life purpose. He desperately wanted to aggressively, violently tear down absolutely everything Gabriel loved. He wanted to totally break our safe, happy, deeply peaceful family. He wanted us to painfully, horribly feel the exact same deep, unending loss he felt every single day. Later that exact same cold night, Tomas violently broke into the dark, empty center again. He aggressively kicked the heavy steel back door wide open. He was carrying a heavy, fully loaded, highly dangerous handgun. He was shaking violently, uncontrollably with pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. Gabriel and I were waiting quietly, completely still in the dark shadows of the main hallway. We did not bring any hidden, illegal weapons, we did not call any heavy, armed backup, we brought absolute, radical, terrifying vulnerability. Gabriel calmly, slowly stepped out into the dim moonlight, shining brightly through the broken windows. Tomas instantly, aggressively raised the heavy dark gun. He pointed the shaking, deadly barrel directly at Gabriel's broad, totally exposed chest. His young, highly traumatized eyes were totally wild and absolutely terrified. He screamed terrible, heartbreaking, incredibly loud curses into the empty, echoing room. He cried hot, desperate, completely broken tears of pure grief. He yelled that Gabriel's entire family had completely, totally ruined his entire life. This is the exact, crucial moment where fake, highly dramatized Hollywood movies get it completely wrong. True, undeniable strength is not aggressively disarming and angry. Desperate shooter with a slick, fast martial arts move. True, profound strength is completely, totally disarming your own massive, stubborn, deeply ingrained ego. Gabriel did not yell back at the terrified boy. He did not aggressively, defensively justify his dark family history. He did not make any cheap, fake, cowardly excuses. He slowly, deliberately dropped to both of his knees right on the cold, hard, dirty floor. He looked deeply, respectfully up at the terrified, angry boy holding the deadly gun. He completely, unconditionally surrendered his immense, masculine pride. Gabriel softly, highly genuinely, totally broke down and apologized. He deeply apologized for the terrible, unspeakable pain his ruthless father had caused. He totally validated every single ounce of Tomas's burning, highly justified anger. He freely offered his own life, right then and there, if it would finally bring the broken boy true, lasting peace. But he gently, firmly warned Tomas that violent revenge is a totally empty, deeply toxic, completely fatal poison. He firmly told Tomas that pulling that heavy trigger would only permanently, completely destroy his own bright, young soul. He desperately begged the boy to actively choose a much better, totally peaceful path. The heavy, deadly gun very slowly lowered. Tomas's violently shaking hands completely, totally gave out. He totally collapsed heavily onto the dirty, hard floor. He dropped the dangerous, loaded weapon. It clattered incredibly loudly against the hard, cold concrete. He sobbed incredibly loudly, totally uncontrollably. He completely buried his tear-stained face in his shaking hands. The heavy, totally crushing weight of 20 long years of toxic, burning hatred finally completely broke his fragile, exhausted spirit. Now came the absolute hardest, deeply exhausting part of genuine, lasting human healing. We absolutely did not aggressively punish him for breaking the expensive windows. We completely refused to call the cops to lock him inside a dark, hopeless, highly violent cage. We did not physically, aggressively throw him out into the cold, completely unforgiving street. We actively, highly intentionally chose radical, totally unconventional restorative justice. We fiercely, aggressively brought him all the way inside our own private, totally safe lives. We unconditionally gave Tomas a safe, warm, totally private room in our own secure home. We lovingly fed him hot, healthy, home-cooked meals every single night at our family table. We completely surrounded him with the exact, total opposite of what he totally, fully expected. We totally surrounded him with quiet, highly consistent, absolutely undeniable grace. It was an incredibly messy, highly exhausting, totally daily process. Tomas was deeply, incredibly suspicious of our totally pure motives. He was highly defensive, completely closed off, and totally angry. He tried to aggressively, constantly push us away. He yelled loudly, totally unfairly at us. He angrily, violently broke expensive dinner plates. He aggressively pushed our absolute, finite limits to the very edge of human patience. But true, unconditional, totally radical respect is an incredibly stubborn, totally unbreakable thing. I firmly, gently placed a heavy, highly expensive digital camera directly into his trembling, Angry hands. I gently told him to completely stop violently destroying beautiful things. I strongly challenged him to boldly start actively creating beautiful things instead. I meticulously taught him how to physically, safely channel all his dark, chaotic, completely explosive trauma directly through the thick, clear glass lens. I patiently taught him how to safely, deeply process his intense, unspeakable pain entirely visually. Gabriel spent countless, highly patient hours quietly sitting beside him on the warm front porch. They talked openly, highly vulnerably about the terrible, generational, highly toxic curse of the violent mafia. They shared their deep, mutual, incredibly ugly, highly hidden scars. Gabriel slowly, consistently became the exact, highly protective, deeply loving father figure that his own family had violently, cruelly stolen from Tomas. We were actively totally rewiring a deeply broken, highly traumatized human brain using pure, relentless, completely unconditional compassion. We were totally breaking the endless, highly deadly cycle of urban violence with an overwhelming, massive flood of pure, highly targeted education. We actively proved that absolutely nobody is ever totally, permanently beyond saving. The ultimate, highly terrifying test of true, lasting rehabilitation always comes highly unexpectedly. It never ever waits for you to be fully, totally ready. Exactly 6 hard months later, the dark, highly violent streets aggressively tried to claim Tomas right back. A small, highly violent, deeply aggressive splinter faction of his old street gang quietly tracked him down. They cornered him violently, highly aggressively in the dark, narrow, totally isolated alley right behind the busy youth center. They heavily aggressively pressured him to finally finish the brutal, bloody, totally unfinished job. They aggressively handed him a brand new, fully loaded, highly dangerous weapon. They fiercely, violently demanded that he actively shoot Gabriel right then and there to finally prove his total, absolute loyalty. Gabriel was quietly, totally unknowingly taking out the heavy, black trash bags. He was totally unarmed. He was completely, entirely vulnerable to a sudden, highly fatal attack. He absolutely did not see them hiding quietly in the dark, cold shadows. I watched the terrifying, highly deadly scene entirely unfold through the back office glass window. My heart completely, totally stopped beating in my chest. I desperately, panickingly reached for the heavy red emergency alarm firmly mounted on the wall, but Tomas absolutely did not raise the heavy gun. He firmly, totally resolutely turned his back totally on his old, highly violent, completely broken life. He bravely, highly boldly stood directly, firmly between the angry, heavily armed gang members and Gabriel. He raised his hands highly peacefully, completely unarmed. He spoke with a brand new, incredibly strong, totally unbreakable, highly confident voice. He firmly, loudly told them that the bloody, totally pointless street war was completely, permanently over. He strongly, aggressively told them that this totally safe youth center was his actual, true family now. He actively, fiercely refused to let any more innocent, warm blood spill on that cold, cracked pavement. The seasoned, highly hardened gang members were totally, completely stunned by his absolute, unwavering, totally fearless conviction. They cursed loudly, highly aggressively at him. They aggressively, violently threatened his young, brave life, but they slowly, highly reluctantly backed away, entirely into the dark, cold, completely empty shadows. They totally, completely left him alone. They clearly realized they absolutely could not break his incredibly strong, totally renewed spirit. Tomas turned slowly around and looked directly, deeply at Gabriel. They did not verbally say a single, quiet word. They simply, heavily embraced each other incredibly tightly in the dark, dirty, highly dangerous alley. It was a massive, highly profound seismic shift in the entire, completely chaotic universe. The bloody, endless, totally toxic cycle of generational, deadly revenge was finally, physically, permanently broken. It was absolutely not broken by a corrupt, angry, highly biased judge. It was totally not broken by an aggressive, highly violent police officer. It was totally, completely broken by a deeply hurt, highly angry kid who was finally, lovingly given a safe, completely secure space to properly heal. He boldly, totally fiercely chose unconditional, radical love over deep, burning, highly toxic hatred. He actively, bravely saved the very man who was always supposed to be his absolute greatest, most hated enemy. Our beautiful, highly complicated city will absolutely always be a massive, deeply flawed, incredibly chaotic mess. You absolutely cannot magically, totally save every single broken, highly traumatized person. You absolutely cannot magically, instantly fix every single deeply corrupt, totally broken systemic issue completely overnight. But you can absolutely always fundamentally, totally changed the tiny, incredibly important piece of the world standing right directly in front of you. I sat quietly, completely at peace on our warm, safe back porch that cool, beautiful summer evening. I happily watched Gabriel gently, lovingly rocking our deeply sleeping son Leo in his strong, heavily scarred, totally safe arms. Tomas was sitting quietly, right closely next to them on the wooden steps. He was carefully, meticulously adjusting the delicate, highly complex lens on his brand new, extremely expensive professional camera. He was safely, totally peacefully, taking beautiful, highly focused, quiet pictures of the bright, shining, totally distant stars. My heart was completely, overwhelmingly, totally full of pure, undeniable, highly profound peace. We had successfully, bravely survived the absolute worst of brutal, totally unforgiving human nature. We had fiercely, completely fearlessly looked the darkest, most terrifying, highly dangerous monsters directly in the eye, and we had actively, highly intentionally chosen to consistently respond with radical, totally unconditional education. We consistently chose to fiercely respond with absolute, fundamental, totally unwavering human respect. Healing a violently broken, highly traumatized world is absolutely never a totally passive, easy event. It is a highly aggressive, deeply intentional, totally exhausting daily action. You have to stubbornly, actively choose radical forgiveness, right exactly when the toxic, burning anger feels so much easier. You have to fiercely, highly aggressively protect the vulnerable, totally innocent people standing quietly behind you. You have to bravely, boldly pick up your heavy, totally reliable camera. You have to strongly, highly aggressively demand the absolute, totally undeniable truth. You have to completely, totally refuse to ever let the heavy, dark, completely cold shadows win. Every single, highly flawed human being deeply deserves a second, totally real chance at a beautiful, highly peaceful life. Every single deep, ugly, highly painful scar can eventually completely become a powerful, highly educational, totally inspiring story. You just have to bravely, stubbornly keep the bright, clear lens cap entirely off. You have to keep fiercely, actively looking for the highly hidden, totally beautiful light. You have to strongly, completely believe that pure, undeniable, totally radical love is absolutely always the absolute ultimate, totally final victory. The dark, terrifying, highly violent storm is finally, completely, totally over. We are totally, completely safe. We are entirely, totally free. And we will absolutely never, ever stop actively, fiercely fighting for the beautiful, totally undeniable truth. You always look for danger in the dark, quiet shadows. You expect the worst threats to hold heavy, loaded guns. You completely forget to check the absolute most basic, totally everyday things. You forget to carefully check the actual water coming directly out of your own kitchen sink. It was the middle of a blisteringly hot, completely unforgiving Chicago summer. The massive youth center was completely packed with energetic, highly happy kids, but something was totally, fundamentally, deeply wrong. My bright, highly active photography students were getting incredibly, dangerously sick. They were constantly, totally exhausted. They were experiencing terrible, violent, highly terrifying nosebleeds. They had heavy dark, sickly circles totally under their young eyes. It was absolutely not a normal, simple summer flu. It was a highly localized, totally terrifying, completely silent epidemic. It was absolutely only happening in our deeply neglected, totally poor, highly vulnerable neighborhood. Gabriel and I did not just passively, quietly wait for the corrupt city health department to act. We aggressively, fiercely started asking hard, highly uncomfortable questions. We clearly noticed the tap water in the youth center smelled faintly like bitter, heavy metal. It had a terrifying, totally unnatural, deeply sickly yellowish tint. We absolutely did not ignore the obvious, deadly, totally undeniable warning signs. We fiercely gathered dozens of clean, totally sterile glass bottles. We collected water samples from every single block in Englewood. We totally bypassed the deeply compromised, totally corrupt local city science labs. We actively sent the water samples to a highly secure, completely independent university testing facility. The scientific results came back absolutely, undeniably, completely devastating. Our local community water supply was completely, heavily, highly intentionally poisoned. It was totally saturated with incredibly toxic, highly dangerous industrial heavy metals. The poor, highly vulnerable kids were literally, slowly drinking highly toxic poison every single day. A wealthy, comfortable, highly protected neighborhood would have been instantly, totally evacuated. But the corrupt city officials completely, actively ignored our totally forgotten streets. They actively chose absolute, deadly, highly toxic silence over basic, fundamental human decency. They totally treated our beautiful, highly resilient community like a disposable, completely worthless garbage dump. We absolutely refused to let them quietly, aggressively poison our beautiful, totally innocent children. We instantly aggressively went to total, highly peaceful, completely strategic war. Gabriel completely, firmly shut off the main water valves to the entire, massive youth center. He aggressively used his massive, totally legitimate logistics company to instantly mobilize a massive fleet of heavy delivery trucks. He bought tens of thousands of gallons of pure, totally safe, incredibly clean bottled water. He totally turned the busy youth center into a massive, highly efficient, completely free clean water distribution hub. We did not just quietly, passively hand out the safe water. We actively, fiercely, totally educated every single terrified family who walked through our open doors. We told them the absolute, highly disturbing, totally unvarnished truth about the toxic tap water. Meanwhile, I aggressively, fiercely weaponized my heavy, totally reliable camera. I did not take pretty, highly sanitized pictures of the bright, beautiful city skyline. I fiercely took incredibly raw, deeply terrifying, totally undeniable portraits of the highly sick, totally exhausted children. I clearly, explicitly photographed the disgusting, yellow, highly toxic water pouring directly out of the broken, rusted neighborhood faucets. I explicitly captured the absolute, undeniable, totally devastating human cost of deep, systemic, highly toxic environmental racism. Tomas and Julian proudly, fiercely led our brave, highly motivated teenage students. They did not just violently, aggressively riot in the hot, angry streets. They actively, meticulously mapped the entire, highly complex underground city water grid. They totally traced the dark, toxic chemical spread directly back to its absolute, deadly, totally undeniable source. It was a massive, highly profitable, totally unregulated chemical manufacturing plant. It was located right on the absolute edge of our poor, highly vulnerable neighborhood. The arrogant, highly wealthy factory owners were actively, totally illegally dumping thousands of gallons of highly toxic waste directly into our fragile local groundwater. They were aggressively saving millions of dirty, highly corrupt corporate dollars. They were literally, directly paying for their massive, totally obscene corporate bonuses with the fragile, totally innocent lives of our sick children. The deeply corrupt, highly ambitious city mayor aggressively tried to completely cover up the massive, totally deadly scandal. He actively sent heavily armed, totally intimidating, city police officers directly to our safe youth center. They aggressively tried to force us to stop publicly distributing the clean, totally safe bottled water. They heavily, violently threatened to completely shut our massive building down for fake, totally fabricated health code violations. The massive, totally sickening, highly offensive irony was absolutely infuriating. Gabriel absolutely did not back down for a single, quiet, terrified fraction of a second. He did not aggressively reach for a deadly, illegal, highly dangerous weapon. He calmly, fiercely stood directly in front of the highly armed, totally aggressive police officers. He spoke with absolute, terrifying, completely unyielding, totally solid moral authority. He loudly, aggressively demanded to know why they were fiercely protecting a highly toxic, totally illegal corporate polluter, instead of actively protecting the innocent, highly sick children. He loudly, totally shamed them in front of the entire, deeply watching neighborhood. He actively made them look directly at the terrified, highly vulnerable mothers tightly holding their sick, fragile babies. The aggressive, highly armed cops completely faltered. They totally lowered their heavy, dangerous weapons. They slowly, highly reluctantly backed entirely, completely away. We absolutely knew we had to aggressively hit the corrupt system directly, where it completely hurt the most. We actively took my raw, highly undeniable, completely devastating photographs. We took the highly complex, totally verified, completely undeniable scientific water testing data. Carmen aggressively, fearlessly published every single terrifying, totally undeniable detail on the absolute front page of the massive national news network. We did not just politely ask for basic, quiet help. We aggressively, loudly, fiercely demanded absolute, immediate, total federal intervention. We totally exposed the massive, incredibly deadly corporate cover-up to the entire, totally shocked, completely angry world. The arrogant, totally corrupt mayor was completely, totally publicly humiliated on a massive, highly visible national stage. The massive, totally explosive national public outrage was completely, absolutely instantaneous. You absolutely cannot magically, quietly unsee the highly documented, totally terrifying reality of intentionally poisoned children. The heavy, totally undeniable weight of the absolute truth completely crushed the corrupt, wealthy political machine. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency instantly descended completely upon the city. They fiercely raided the massive, highly toxic chemical plant. They aggressively arrested the greedy, highly arrogant corporate executives. They permanently shut the illegal, highly deadly factory entirely down forever. The highly corrupt, deeply embarrassed mayor was aggressively forced to instantly resign in complete public disgrace. But the real, deep, profound healing absolutely did not stop with the high-profile criminal arrests. Gabriel heavily used our massive, independent community foundation. He aggressively hired completely independent, highly ethical civil engineers. We absolutely did not trust the corrupt city to ever fix the broken, toxic pipes properly. We actively, funded the massive, highly complex, incredibly expensive complete replacement of the entire neighborhood water infrastructure. We ripped the old, toxic, heavily corroded lead pipes completely out of the dirty ground. We actively replaced them with brand new, safe, highly clean infrastructure. We completely hired the hardworking, highly dedicated men and women directly from our own struggling neighborhood to do the massive, highly difficult physical labor. We actively turned a massive, deadly environmental tragedy into a highly beautiful, empowering community jobs program. We actively taught the vulnerable, highly marginalized people how to physically, beautifully rebuild their own broken community from the absolute ground up. The kids beautifully stopped being completely sick. The heavy, dark, terrifying circles faded completely from under their bright, highly hopeful eyes. Their beautiful, loud, highly energetic laughter completely returned to the busy, safe hallways of our youth center. We had actively fought a completely invisible, deadly, highly toxic monster. We had absolutely won using pure, undeniably raw, incredibly aggressive truth. True, lasting, undeniable peace is absolutely never a permanent, easily guaranteed state of being. The dark, greedy, highly toxic monsters will absolutely always keep trying to quietly sneak back in. They will actively try to poison your safe water. They will aggressively try to steal your fragile, hard-won peace. But Gabriel and I are absolutely, ready for them. We sat quietly, completely happily on the warm, safe steps of our beautiful, rebuilt youth center. The bright, clean, incredibly fresh summer water was happily splashing in the brand new community fountain. Our sweet son Leo was laughing incredibly loudly, safely running through the bright, clean water. Tomas and Julian were happily showing the younger kids how to safely use their heavy, highly reliable cameras. I gently rested my tired, heavy head softly against Gabriel's broad, incredibly strong, safe shoulder. He gently kissed the top of my messy, dark hair. We completely realized that the absolute, most deeply profound form of true human rebellion is simply choosing to actively heal. It is fiercely, aggressively looking at a broken, highly toxic, completely corrupted system and absolutely refusing to ever quietly accept it. You absolutely must always hold your heavy, reliable camera. You must always aggressively, loudly document the ugly, completely undeniable reality. You must intentionally, fiercely educate the vulnerable, terrified young generation. You must teach them to strictly demand absolute, fundamental, unconditional human respect. The entire, flawed world will always aggressively try to break your soft, highly compassionate heart, but a deeply educated, unified, highly respected community can absolutely never, ever be broken. Do not ever let the cold, bitter, highly toxic world quietly defeat you. Keep your bright, warm, incredibly powerful fire aggressively burning. Keep fiercely, actively loving the broken, highly vulnerable people directly around you. That is the absolute, truly undeniable, completely magic way you change the entire world. That is exactly how you fiercely, actively, permanently win. You think you have finally defeated the absolute worst monsters. You think the dark storms are over. You breathe a deep, highly exhausted sigh of relief. Our beautiful, fiercely resilient neighborhood was finally, truly healing. The local water was completely clean and safe. The young kids were laughing incredibly loudly in the bright, busy streets. The massive, beautiful youth center was packed every single day. Gabriel and I were incredibly exhausted but profoundly, deeply happy. We truly thought we had finally won the ultimate, lasting war. We were completely, devastatingly wrong. The greedy, highly toxic monsters never actually leave the city. They just quietly change their highly expensive clothes. They completely change their aggressive, totally ruthless tactics. They stop poisoning the physical, dirty water. They start actively, intentionally poisoning the fragile, highly vulnerable minds of the youth. A massive, totally ruthless corporate entity quietly moved into Chicago. They were boldly called Summit Educational Partners. They were a massive, highly profitable, totally private charter school network. They quietly bought up 3 struggling public schools right in our neighborhood. They made incredibly shiny, highly aggressive, totally fake promises. They loudly promised total academic excellence. They aggressively promised to completely save our disadvantaged, poor children. They painted the old, heavy brick buildings in bright, totally cheerful colors. They put up massive, totally fake smiling billboards everywhere. But it was all an incredibly dark, highly toxic, totally elaborate trap. Corporate greed in education is absolutely, profoundly terrifying. It treats highly vulnerable, deeply traumatized children exactly like disposable, cheap commodities. We slowly started noticing a terrible, highly disturbing change in our students. The bright, happy kids from the youth center were becoming incredibly, deeply anxious. They were totally losing their loud, beautiful, highly contagious laughter. They were walking down the street with their young, heavy shoulders completely slumped. They looked absolutely, totally, completely terrified. Summit did not actually want to educate our kids. They wanted to aggressively, ruthlessly exploit them for massive government funding. They implemented completely draconian, highly toxic zero-tolerance policies. They ran the bright, colorful schools exactly like dark, maximum security prisons. They banned all creative, highly expressive arts. They completely banned loud talking in the long, sterile hallways. They hired massive, highly aggressive, heavily armed private security guards. They actively, intentionally criminalized totally normal, highly innocent teenage behavior. They aggressively wanted to push out any single student who slightly struggled. They wanted to artificially, totally illegally, inflate their standardized test scores. They actively funneled the slightly difficult kids directly into the brutal, highly violent juvenile justice system. It is called the deadly, highly toxic school-to-prison pipeline, and it was actively, violently destroying our beautiful, totally innocent community. They treated a dropped pencil like a massive, violent felony. They treated a quiet whisper like a totally dangerous, aggressive threat. They completely stripped away every single ounce of basic human dignity. They actively wanted to break the strong, beautiful spirits of our kids. They wanted them completely docile, totally terrified, entirely compliant. The wealthy, highly arrogant CEO of Summit was a man named Richard Sterling. He lived in a massive, totally secure, highly expensive mansion in a rich suburb. He absolutely never visited our struggling, poor neighborhood. He only saw our beautiful children as tiny, highly profitable numbers on a cold spreadsheet. He made tens of millions of dollars every single year. He made his massive fortune by actively destroying vulnerable, highly innocent families. Gabriel and I absolutely refused to let him quietly win. We had actively fought incredibly violent mafia bosses. We had successfully fought highly greedy chemical polluters. We were absolutely not afraid of a totally corrupt educational CEO. We aggressively started asking extremely hard, highly uncomfortable questions. We totally transformed our youth center into a massive, highly organized investigative hub. We did not use illegal, highly violent weapons. We aggressively used absolute, undeniable, totally verified truth. We deeply educated our brave, highly resilient students about their fundamental, absolute civil rights. We taught them exactly how to legally, safely document the severe, highly toxic emotional abuse. We handed out tiny, highly secure digital cameras. We told them to safely, secretly document the terrifying, prison-like conditions inside the bright schools. We told them to fiercely capture the absolute, totally unvarnished truth. We absolutely knew the corrupt city politicians were heavily bribed by Summit. We knew we had to aggressively build a massive, completely undeniable mountain of hard evidence. We had to totally expose the dark, highly toxic rot hiding directly behind the bright, shiny corporate logo. We completely mobilized our entire, totally unified community. We held massive, totally secret meetings late at night. We deeply listened to the terrified, completely heartbroken parents. We totally validated their intense, totally justified anger. We slowly, meticulously built a totally unstoppable, highly educated army of fierce truth seekers. We were absolutely, totally ready for a massive, completely legal, totally public war. The absolutely inevitable, deeply terrifying breaking point happened on a freezing Tuesday morning. It happened to a brilliant, incredibly shy 14-year-old girl named Elena. Elena was one of my absolute best, most highly talented photography students. She had a deeply troubled, highly traumatic home life. She heavily used her camera to safely process her intense, unspeakable pain. She was actively, beautifully healing through her raw, highly emotional art. Summit Educational Partners absolutely hated her independent, highly creative spirit. They completely confiscated her expensive digital camera during a quiet lunch break. They falsely, aggressively accused her of attempting to steal it. Elena panicked completely and totally shut down. She tried to quietly, desperately take her own personal camera back. The massive, highly aggressive corporate security guards instantly, violently tackled her. They aggressively slammed the tiny, fragile girl directly into the hard metal lockers. They tightly, aggressively, handcuffed her thin wrists behind her back. They completely, totally, devastatingly traumatized her. They immediately, aggressively called the local city police. They officially charged a completely innocent 14-year-old girl with a massive, highly violent felony assault. They aggressively expelled her on the exact same day. They threw her directly into the cold, completely unforgiving juvenile justice system. Elena came straight to our safe youth center that freezing evening. She was sobbing completely, totally uncontrollably. Her tiny, fragile wrists were deeply, horribly bruised. Her beautiful, bright spirit was completely, totally shattered. Gabriel saw her hot, heavy, incredibly terrified tears. The terrifying, incredibly cold, highly dangerous Mafia boss instantly woke up directly inside his deep green eyes. His broad jaw locked incredibly, terrifyingly tight. His heavy hands clenched into massive, completely violent fists. The dark, totally familiar temptation of aggressive, completely illegal sabotage was incredibly strong. He desperately wanted to violently drive directly to the massive corporate headquarters. He wanted to aggressively smash their shiny glass doors into a million tiny pieces. He wanted to heavily, violently threaten the arrogant CEO with his bare hands. He wanted to totally, completely destroy the cruel monsters who hurt Elena. I absolutely had to act very, very fast. I firmly, instantly grabbed his shaking, heavy hands. I tightly squeezed his faded, heavily scarred knuckles. I looked deeply into his wild, angry, totally terrified eyes. I silently, fiercely reminded him of our totally unbreakable, beautiful promise. We absolutely do not use their violent, dark, totally toxic weapons anymore. If we use illegal, aggressive violence now, we instantly become the exact same monsters we completely destroyed. We aggressively use absolute, undeniable, totally public truth. Gabriel took a massive, incredibly shaky, very deep breath. He slowly, deliberately, totally completely stepped back from the dark edge. He absolutely chose the bright, peaceful light. We completely surrounded Elena with quiet, total, highly radical love. We actively, fiercely promised to totally clear her good name. We heavily promised to completely destroy the corrupt corporation, using only the absolute truth. We absolutely did not sleep for a single quiet second that entire long week. We were actively, fiercely planning a massive, highly strategic, totally legal, completely modern war. We totally refused to fight a highly complex corporate war with cheap, low-tech street anger. We had to fiercely, aggressively fight the corrupt system with absolute, undeniable human truth. Sophia and her brilliant, highly dedicated legal team worked totally without sleep. They aggressively drafted a massive, highly complex, deeply devastating civil rights lawsuit. They fiercely, meticulously subpoenaed thousands of highly secretive corporate emails. They aggressively forced the arrogant company to legally hand over their totally hidden financial records. Gabriel heavily used his massive, completely clean logistical wealth. He hired the absolute best, highly ethical, brilliant forensic accountants in the entire country. They actively, aggressively audited the deeply hidden, totally corrupt corporate ledgers. They totally, mathematically proved the massive, highly illegal financial fraud. Summit Educational Partners was absolutely not spending the massive government funding on the poor students. They were actively, illegally, funneling tens of millions of dollars directly into hidden offshore bank accounts. They were taking massive, highly illegal kickbacks from private, for-profit juvenile detention centers. They literally paid massive bonuses every single time they actively expelled a vulnerable child. It was a massive, incredibly disgusting, totally illegal, human trafficking ring heavily disguised as a school. It was absolute, pure, undeniable corporate evil. Meanwhile, I actively, aggressively organized my brave photography students. We meticulously gathered all the tiny, highly secret digital cameras we had handed out. We actively downloaded hundreds of hours of raw, highly terrifying, completely undeniable video footage. The brave kids had successfully, totally documented the absolute nightmare. They captured the aggressive security guards, violently pushing small children. They explicitly captured the incredibly crowded, completely unheated, totally silent classrooms. They totally proved the bright, smiling corporate billboards were a massive, disgusting lie. Carmen actively used her massive, highly respected national journalistic platform. She wrote a massive, highly technical, deeply explosive investigative series. She aggressively exposed the highly secretive tech billionaires and corrupt politicians who actively funded the deeply flawed schools. She completely proved they totally knew the complex system was heavily abusive. They actively chose massive, totally obscene corporate profits over basic, fundamental human rights. We completely surrounded the arrogant corporate executives with blinding, absolute, undeniable truth. We actively, meticulously built a totally airtight, completely devastating legal and public case. We were absolutely, totally ready to completely annihilate them. The ultimate, highly intense showdown finally happened exactly where it completely mattered the most. It happened at the massive, totally packed monthly city school board meeting. The highly arrogant, totally corrupt CEO, Richard Sterling, stood proudly at the front podium. He wore a custom, incredibly expensive suit. He smirked highly confidently at the corrupt, heavily bribed city council members. He was aggressively demanding a massive 10-year contract renewal. He truly thought he had enough dark money to easily buy the entire city. He completely, totally underestimated our highly educated, deeply unified community. We had totally packed the large room with hundreds of angry, hopeful neighborhood residents. We absolutely did not violently riot or loudly scream. We sat in highly organized, totally deafening, completely unified silence. I walked slowly, highly confidently up to the main public microphone. I did not yell in anger. I deliberately turned off the bright overhead lights. I projected my students' incredibly powerful, raw, totally terrifying video footage directly onto the massive white wall behind the council. The huge room went totally, breathlessly silent. I showed them the exact, undeniable human cost of their greedy, corrupt decisions. I explicitly showed the aggressive, highly questionable tactics of the corporate security thugs. I showed them tiny fragile Elena being violently tackled for simply holding a camera. Then Elena bravely stepped up to the microphone. She was absolutely not a terrified little girl anymore. She looked the powerful corporate billionaire directly, fiercely in the eye. She firmly, highly eloquently stated that her community was not garbage to be casually swept away. She aggressively, loudly demanded absolute, basic human dignity. She actively proved that human resilience is absolutely infinitely more powerful than any corrupt corporation. Then Sophia calmly laid down the massive stack of explosive legal and financial documents. She totally exposed the massive, highly illegal offshore kickbacks. She clearly proved the disgusting, highly illegal school-to-prison pipeline. Gabriel stood quietly in the very back of the room. He radiated a calm, terrifying, completely legal authority. The arrogant CEO started sweating profusely. His incredibly expensive face turned totally, completely pale. He tried to loudly interrupt Elena. He tried to aggressively bully the quiet teenager, but the entire crowded room instantly erupted into massive, deafening chants. They loudly, fiercely demanded absolute justice. The corrupt city council members absolutely panicked. They saw the bright national television cameras, recording every single second. They instantly, unanimously voted to completely cancel the massive corporate contract entirely. The massive, greedy corporate educational conglomerate was totally, publicly crushed on the spot. The massive, totally undeniable public shame completely, totally crushed the arrogant corporate executives. Carmen's highly explosive, totally undeniable national news report completely destroyed their fake, clean public image. The strict federal Department of Education aggressively, instantly descended completely upon the corrupt company. They heavily, fiercely raided the massive, totally illegal corporate headquarters. They aggressively revoked the educational licenses of the greedy, highly arrogant executives. The federal police aggressively arrested the wealthy CEO directly in his massive mansion. They completely, permanently shut the highly deadly, totally illegal corporate network entirely down forever. But the real deep, totally profound healing absolutely did not stop with the high-profile criminal arrests. The city officially handed the bright, beautiful schools directly back to the actual local community. We totally, completely transformed them. We heavily funded massive, highly robust creative arts programs. We immediately fired all the aggressive security guards. We actively hired highly trained, deeply empathetic trauma counselors. Elena's totally fake, highly unjust criminal charges were immediately permanently dropped, she proudly, happily returned to my advanced photography class. Her beautiful, bright spirit completely, totally healed. Gabriel and I sat quietly, completely happily on the warm, safe steps of our beautiful youth center. That crisp, clear night, we peacefully watched our sweet son Leo happily, safely playing with the older, thriving teenagers. We absolutely know that deep, systemic, completely generational healing is actually totally possible. You just have to bravely, stubbornly refuse to ever quietly give up. The dark, greedy, highly toxic monsters will absolutely always try to forcefully, violently return. They will always try to quietly exploit the weak. But our fiercely educated, totally unified, completely unbroken community is absolutely ready for them now. We will always confidently pick up our heavy, totally reliable cameras. We will always strongly, aggressively demand the absolute, undeniable truth. We have totally found our ultimate, lasting, highly profound peace in the fierce, beautiful, never-ending fight for basic, unconditional human dignity. You absolutely cannot fight total darkness with more cheap, violent darkness. You have to actively, aggressively, totally flood the room with blinding, absolute light. You have to strictly, firmly demand absolute, fundamental, totally unconditional human respect. We have successfully, actively healed our totally broken, highly beautiful city. We have absolutely, finally found our permanent, totally unbreakable, beautifully undeniable peace. You truly think you can completely bury the dark past. You think if you just pile enough good deeds on top of it, it will totally disappear. You build beautiful youth centers. You plant bright, vibrant community gardens. You aggressively save thousands of innocent, vulnerable lives. You think the heavy, toxic soil is finally completely clean. But the deep, dark past is exactly like a highly dormant, totally stubborn seed. It absolutely only needs a single, tiny drop of water to instantly sprout right back up. Our beautiful innocent son Leo was absolutely everything to us. He grew up completely surrounded by radical, unconditional love. He only ever knew Gabriel as a gentle, highly patient teacher. He only ever knew me as a passionate, deeply dedicated artist. He grew up inside the totally safe, highly protective walls of our thriving community center. He was incredibly smart. He was highly observant. He had a deeply sensitive, totally beautiful soul. But teenagers are naturally, aggressively curious. They actively want to deeply understand the entire, highly complex world. They want to completely uncover every single hidden truth. Leo was 15 years old. He was working on a massive, highly detailed history project for his high school. He was actively researching the deep, complex political history of Chicago. He was spending long, quiet hours in the massive public library. He was scrolling deeply through highly archived, totally forgotten, digital newspaper records. He absolutely was not looking for our dark, hidden family secrets, but the digital internet absolutely never, ever forgets anything. It keeps every single dark, violent, totally bloody record perfectly preserved. He found an old, heavily archived investigative article. It was from exactly 16 years ago. It heavily featured a highly terrifying, totally chilling photograph. It was a picture of Gabriel, but he did not look like the gentle, smiling father Leo totally knew and deeply loved. He looked incredibly dangerous. He looked totally, completely, aggressively lethal. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit. He was surrounded by heavy, violent, totally armed Mafia enforcers. The massive, bold headline was completely, absolutely devastating. It called Gabriel the ruthless, highly dangerous king of the violent Chicago underworld. It detailed the heavy, bloody gang wars. It talked about the terrible, violent shootings. It completely laid out the massive, highly toxic criminal empire. Leo kept aggressively clicking. He kept frantically reading. He found the old, terrifying stories about my parents being murdered. He found the stories about the violent, totally deadly shootout in the dark warehouse. His totally safe, highly protected, completely innocent world totally, instantly shattered into a million tiny, sharp pieces. He absolutely did not come home from the library that quiet afternoon. He totally turned off his heavy, expensive smartphone. He completely, aggressively vanished into the massive, highly complex city. Gabriel and I were completely, totally frantic. We aggressively called every single one of his totally confused friends. We searched every single quiet park in our totally safe neighborhood. The deep, heavy, totally suffocating panic completely gripped my tired chest. I instantly felt the exact same terrifying, totally dark fear I felt over 15 years ago. Gabriel's face turned incredibly, totally, terrifyingly pale. His heavy, scarred hands were violently, visibly shaking. He desperately wanted to aggressively tear the entire, massive city completely apart. He heavily, dangerously paced the quiet living room floor. He aggressively picked up his phone. He desperately wanted to call his old, highly dangerous, completely underground contacts. He wanted to violently mobilize a massive, heavily armed search party. He wanted to aggressively use the dark, totally toxic fear to instantly find his missing son. I absolutely had to stop him again. I fiercely grabbed his broad, shaking shoulders. I deeply looked directly into his totally terrified, highly wild eyes. I strictly reminded him that we absolutely do not ever use those dark tools anymore. If we aggressively use the highly toxic Mafia tactics to find Leo, we instantly confirm every single terrible thing he just read online. We absolutely prove to our son that we are still the exact same violent monsters. We have to fiercely, entirely trust the beautiful, totally safe community we actively built. We aggressively called Tomas and Julian. They were fully grown, highly respected, totally strong men now. They instantly, fiercely mobilized the entire, massive youth center network. Hundreds of deeply grateful, highly loyal community members totally flooded the busy city streets. They actively, peacefully searched every single dark alley. They respectfully asked every single local shop owner. They did not use aggressive threats. They used deep, totally genuine, highly respectful community connections. They were actively fighting for the exact same family that had completely, totally saved them. They finally found Leo very late that freezing, totally dark night. He was sitting completely alone on a cold, hard concrete bench. He was sitting right by the dark, heavy, freezing waters of Lake Michigan. He looked incredibly small. He looked totally, completely, devastatingly broken. Gabriel and I slowly, carefully walked up to him. We did not aggressively yell. We did not fiercely demand answers. We quietly, respectfully sat down right directly next to him on the freezing bench. Leo did not look at us. He fiercely stared out at the totally dark, freezing water. He was crying incredibly quietly. His young, thin shoulders were totally shaking. He finally spoke. His voice was totally raw, completely hoarse, and deeply hurt. He asked Gabriel if it was actually totally true. He asked if Gabriel really used to deeply hurt vulnerable people. He asked if Gabriel really ordered violent, totally deadly hits. The heavy, dark, completely suffocating silence hung between us like a massive physical weight. Gabriel did not try to actively lie. He did not aggressively make totally fake, cheap excuses. He completely, totally surrendered his immense, heavy pride. He looked directly at his crying, deeply heartbroken son. Gabriel heavily, slowly nodded his head. He firmly, totally honestly said yes. He completely owned every single dark, violent, highly toxic mistake. Leo angrily, aggressively stood up. He yelled incredibly loudly. He fiercely said our entire, beautiful life was a massive, totally disgusting lie. He said we were total, complete, highly fake hypocrites. He said we loudly preached absolute peace and total respect. But we actually built our foundation on dirty, violent, totally bloody money. His highly angry, completely justified words cut me deeper than any sharp physical knife ever could. It was the absolute, totally devastating consequence of our highly hidden, completely buried past, and we had aggressively tried to totally protect him from the ugly, dark truth, but highly guarded. Totally buried secrets always eventually rot. They always actively poison the beautiful, totally innocent things growing right directly above them. We did not forcefully, aggressively drag him back home. We totally respected his deep, completely undeniable anger. We quietly walked right behind him as he angrily stomped down the long, cold city blocks. We completely let him actively express his intense, highly raw, totally justified trauma. When we finally got back to our quiet, safe house, we completely, totally changed our entire family dynamic. We completely stopped actively treating him like a fragile, highly innocent little boy. We firmly sat him down at the heavy, oak kitchen table. We did not hold a single, tiny dark detail back. I fiercely told him the exact, totally true story of how my parents were brutally, violently murdered. I told him how totally dark, incredibly lonely, and completely terrifying my young life was. Gabriel deeply, highly vulnerably told him about growing up inside a totally toxic, highly violent Mafia family. He told Leo exactly how he was heavily groomed to be a totally ruthless, completely cold killer. He explicitly detailed the immense, totally suffocating pressure. He talked about the deep, highly painful, completely violent trauma, and then we told him the absolute, incredibly beautiful truth about our massive, radical transformation. We fiercely explained exactly why we totally walked completely away. We actively told him about the incredibly hard, highly exhausting, totally daily work of genuine redemption. We deeply explained that true, lasting human respect is absolutely not something you are magically, easily born with. It is a highly difficult, totally conscious. Incredibly brave choice. You absolutely must make every single day. We told him that his own safe, incredibly beautiful, highly peaceful life was completely, totally paid for. It was deeply paid for by our fierce, highly intentional, totally aggressive choice to completely break the toxic, bloody cycle. We totally proved to him that fundamentally flawed, deeply broken humans absolutely can totally change. We showed him that the dark, highly terrifying past absolutely does not have to constantly dictate the entire, beautiful future. We aggressively flooded his total darkness with blinding, absolute, highly vulnerable light. Healing from a massive, totally devastating betrayal of deep trust takes a very long time. Leo did not magically instantly forgive us overnight. He was deeply quiet for many, highly tensed weeks. He was totally distant. He was actively processing the massive, incredibly complex, totally heavy truth, but slowly, beautifully, highly miraculously, he started to genuinely understand. He quietly started paying much closer attention to exactly how Gabriel actively treated people right now. He totally saw the deep, genuine, completely undeniable respect Gabriel actively showed to the struggling kids at the youth center. He actively watched me fiercely, tirelessly fight for the highly marginalized, totally forgotten neighborhood families. He completely realized that our totally sincere, highly aggressive daily actions were absolutely screaming, much louder than the dark, highly distant past. One sunny, crisp afternoon, Leo quietly walked into my busy, messy dark room. He gently picked up one of my old, highly battered backup cameras. He looked directly at me with his totally bright, deep green eyes. He softly asked if I could please teach him how to properly use it. He absolutely did not want to passively, quietly hide from the ugly, totally complex world anymore. He actively wanted to completely learn how to fiercely, bravely document the absolute truth. He heavily joined the massive youth center. He did not act like an arrogant, highly privileged insider. He humbly, quietly sat next to the deeply struggling, highly traumatized teenagers. He actively listened to their totally raw, completely painful stories. He deeply realized how incredibly lucky, totally privileged, and completely safe his own life actually was. He actively started a totally brand new, highly successful peer support program. He used his camera to totally, beautifully capture the deep, quiet resilience of the other kids. He totally, beautifully transformed his own massive, highly painful shock into deep, absolute, completely unconditional empathy. We absolutely did not perfectly protect him from the deep, dark, totally ugly pain of the real world, but we absolutely, totally successfully taught him exactly how to bravely, fiercely, highly intentionally heal it. That is the absolute most profound, completely lasting legacy you can ever leave. You totally break the toxic, highly violent chains. You aggressively, deeply educate the next bright generation. You fiercely demand absolute, total human respect, and you absolutely, totally, completely let the bright, beautiful light finally win. Time absolutely does not wait for anyone. It moves quietly, entirely, completely forward. It ignores your massive, totally exhausting battles. It ignores your deep, highly traumatic scars. 30 long, incredibly beautiful years passed. The city of Chicago completely transformed around us. Our small, safe youth center did not stay small. It aggressively, beautifully expanded. It became a massive, highly respected citywide institution. We officially opened 10 different centers across the deeply struggling neighborhoods. Hundreds of thousands of highly vulnerable kids safely walk through our open doors. They learned absolute, undeniable truth. They learned fierce, totally unconditional human respect. They became brilliant lawyers. They became honest, highly ethical politicians. They became incredibly talented, totally fearless journalists. They completely, totally rewrote the dark, violent history of the entire city. Gabriel and I grew gracefully, quietly older. The heavy, dark, violent years took a massive physical toll on his incredibly strong body. His thick dark hair turned completely, beautifully silver. The deep, ugly bullet scars on his broad shoulder faded into soft, pale lines, but his deep green eyes never, ever lost their fierce, highly protective light. He completely stepped down from running the massive foundation. He happily handed the heavy, totally complex reins directly over to the next highly capable generation. He spent his quiet, peaceful days exactly how he truly wanted. He baked warm, fresh bread in my grandmother's old, beautifully restored kitchen. He sat quietly on our safe back porch. He played endless games of chess with the local neighborhood kids. He completely, totally became the gentle, highly respected grandfather of the entire community. He absolutely, definitively proved that a violent, highly dangerous mafia boss could successfully, completely transform into a powerful force for absolute peace. Our son Leo did not run away from his heavy, highly complex family legacy. He bravely, fiercely embraced it. He became a totally fearless, highly respected investigative photojournalist. He took my heavy battered old camera. He traveled to the darkest, most highly dangerous, totally forgotten corners of the entire world. He aggressively documented extreme poverty. He fiercely exposed deep, highly toxic political corruption. He completely, totally carried the bright, heavy torch my own brave parents had initially lit. One crisp, beautiful autumn evening, Leo hosted a massive, highly prestigious gallery exhibition. It was hosted right inside the massive downtown art museum. The large, elegant room was completely packed with highly influential, deeply respectful people. Gabriel and I stood quietly in the very back of the crowded room. We absolutely did not want the bright, flashing public spotlight. We just wanted to peacefully, quietly watch our beautiful son absolutely shine. Leo stepped confidently up to the main wooden podium. The massive, totally crowded room went completely, breathlessly silent. He did not talk about his own massive, highly impressive artistic achievements. He talked fiercely, beautifully about absolute, unconditional human resilience. He loudly projected a massive, stunning black and white photograph onto the main wall. It was a picture I took exactly 30 years ago. It was a picture of Gabriel. He was kneeling quietly in the dark, dirty alley. He was completely surrendering his weapon to the angry, traumatized teenage boy. Leo looked directly out at the massive, quiet crowd. He spoke with absolute, undeniable, totally raw emotion. He firmly said that true power is absolutely never found in a loaded gun. He loudly declared that true, lasting power is only found in radical, totally unconditional forgiveness. He strongly said that you absolutely cannot shoot the deep darkness away. You can only aggressively, fiercely flood the dark room with blinding, absolute light. The entire, massive crowd instantly erupted into totally deafening, highly emotional applause. Gabriel gently reached out. He tightly held my wrinkled, tired hand. He looked directly at me. His beautiful green eyes were completely filled with quiet, happy tears. We had actually, totally, completely done it. We had successfully finished our massive, highly exhausting, incredibly beautiful life's work. We walked slowly, quietly out of the busy, crowded museum. The crisp, cold Chicago wind blew gently against our tired faces. The massive, beautiful city skyline sparkled brightly in the dark night. We walked quietly down to the dark, freezing edge of Lake Michigan. We stood exactly where Leo had cried so many years ago. The heavy, violent, deeply toxic storms were finally, permanently gone. Only the absolute, deep, totally unbreakable peace remained. I looked down at my empty, tired hands. I did not need to carry a heavy camera absolutely everywhere anymore. The absolute, undeniable truth was already firmly planted deep inside the bright, safe city. Healing is an incredibly messy, highly exhausting, totally daily battle. You absolutely will get deeply hurt. You will get incredibly tired. You will desperately want to completely give up. The greedy, highly toxic monsters will always try to loudly roar, but you absolutely cannot let them win. You have to stubbornly, fiercely stand your solid ground. You have to aggressively, loudly demand absolute, fundamental human respect. You have to actively, beautifully choose radical love every single, exhausting day. Look directly at the deeply broken, highly vulnerable people standing right next to you. Do not aggressively judge their heavy, ugly scars. Actively, fiercely help them carry their heavy, totally exhausting weight. Be the bright, safe, totally unbreakable lighthouse in their massive, dark storm. The incredibly flawed, deeply messy world absolutely needs your unique, totally brave voice. Pick up your own heavy camera. Tell your own raw, totally authentic story. Actively, fiercely build your own beautiful, totally safe community, and absolutely never, ever stop fiercely fighting for the bright, healing, completely undeniable light.